Good morning. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I am the President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you all for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this virtual program with an outstanding panel on the recall election. This event is part of PPIC's 2021 speaker series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. Any opinions expressed by our event panelists today are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect any position of the Public Policy Institute of California. We'd like to thank the sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and on our website. This series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle, the PPIC Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor to make more public programs like today's possible. More information is available at ppic.org. Before we begin, if you have a question for our panelists, please send an email to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We would appreciate your including your name and organization along with your question. We'll have time at the end of the program for your questions. To help set the context for the panel discussion, I just want to provide a few takeaways from the recently released PPIC survey. For more details, you could look on our website today at www.ppic.org. Among California likely voters, support for removing Governor Newsom continues to fall short of a majority. In our latest poll, it was 39%. In our two previous polls, it was at 40% in March and May. The approval of Governor Newsom is still in positive territory. Today, it is 53% among likely voters. It was 52% when we conducted our first poll of the year in January. When it comes to the replacement part of the ballot, fewer than half of likely voters say that they're satisfied with the replacement candidates that are on the ballot, 44% in our poll, with Democrats and Republicans and people who are voting yes or no on the first part of the ballot on removing the governor, having starkly different views on their satisfaction with the replacement candidates. And about half of likely voters say that they're either undecided or say they won't vote for any of the replacement candidates, 49% in our poll. Again, starkly different perspectives from those who are voting yes and those who are voting no on the first part of the ballot. So there were a couple of questions that we asked that were repeated from earlier in the year to see whether opinions have shifted. Fewer than half, 44% today, say that the current recall is an appropriate use of the recall process. That's a decline from March, and the group in which the decline has been by far the greatest are Democratic likely voters. 51% said that things would get worse in California if Newsom is recalled. 33% said it would be better if he was recalled. And that number has, the number who say that things have gotten worse has if he was recalled, would get worse, also increased most dramatically among Democrats. And that is the reason for that change in opinion. There's been a lot of discussion in the last month or so, since this is a special election that will take place in 2 weeks, about voter enthusiasm and interest in this election. In this poll, 7 in 10 Californians, 70% with solid majorities across parties, said that the recall outcome is very important to them. So the election outcome, very important to majorities of voters, to whatever their political affiliations, and more, about 53% are saying that they are more enthusiastic. No, I'm sorry, about half, 47% are more enthusiastic about voting than usual, with Republicans and independents, 54% for Republicans, 53% for independents, saying that they're more enthusiastic than usual about voting compared to fewer Democrats, 40%. So those are just some of the highlights. Just wanted to offer them to you. I'm now really pleased to turn this discussion over to the moderator for today's panel, and that is Carla Marinucci, who is a senior writer for Politico's California Playbook, and one of the state's and nation's leading political writers and digital influencers. Carla, thank you so much for being here today and leading this discussion with an outstanding group of journalists.
Mark, thank you so much. We're just honored to be here today, and I'm honored to be here with two of my compadres on the political beat, two of the best reporters in the state, Seema Mehta from the Los Angeles Times and Jenny Medina from the New York Times. We're going to be making this discussion about 45 minutes, and I know a lot of you have questions for Mark. He's going to be coming back at the end of the discussion for your questions. So get them in now at the email listed here. I'm going to start out, Jenny and Seema, with kind of a general question, just kind of to lay the groundwork here on this. I mean, from your work, both of you have been on the ground covering the special election. Let's just say, what do you think is the most important thing, the most consequential thing that our audience should know about the California recall on September 14th? Let me start with you, Seema. What is it? What do you think is the number one?
The thing is, this is such an unusual election. It's taking place in September of an off year. It's every single California registered voter received ballots. So we're sort of in this unknown, uncharted territory here. And so I think, it's the race. We've seen polling, and the polling that came out last night or today, it seems like things are going in Governor Newsom's favor. But if you look at the vote by mail that's been turned in, young people and Latinos are not voting at the numbers that he needs. So he does have some weaknesses. So I think the thing is, we can't predict anything at this moment, and this race is very much in flux.
Yeah, I mean, Jenny, what about you? Most consequential thing, biggest top line here.
I think Seema touched on it already, but the fact that every voter was mailed a ballot is going to tell us a lot about political engagement in this state, because people will make the choice. Do I take the time to fill out a ballot and mail it in, which isn't frankly that hard? Or do I say, I don't know enough? I've talked to a lot of voters who will say, I'm not interested. I'm not paying attention. I don't think I'm qualified. And just sort of disengage. So it will tell us, even regardless of the outcome, it will tell us something about the political engagement in our state.
And for those of us, you've got several hundred people out there listening to this. So I want to give a little history here to those out there familiar. How did we get here? How did we get here that you had Gavin Newsom, who was elected in a landslide in 2018, which was the biggest landslide, by the way, of a non-incumbent since 1930 in this state. How did he get to the point where he's facing this today? Jenny, you go first on this one.
Almost from the moment that Gavin Newsom was elected in the landslide, there were people who were agitating for some kind of recall. As probably many people listening today know, it's quite easy to recall a governor in California. I believe there have been 4 recalls in the country, 2 of which have been in California. So it tells you something about how easy it is to do here. The reason that we're here, big reason that we're here, is because of the pandemic. And a court decision allowed people who were collecting signatures for the recall, allowed that to continue. And it's relatively cheap and relatively easy to get signatures. And they've had a longer time to do it. So there was no reason for people who were supporting this recall for years and years, for them not to do it.
And Seema, we've talked about this. How much is Gavin Newsom himself at fault on this one? What are the weaknesses here that brought him to this point?
There's a couple different things going on. As Jenny talked about, there was this court decision, which every modern governor in recent history has faced multiple recall attempts, as has Newsom. And they usually have not gotten anywhere, but, with the exception of Gray Davis, obviously in 2003. However, these recall backers, they were granted 4 extra months to gather signatures. Newsom's team did not oppose that. I think that's something that's going to be really looked back upon, especially if he is recalled. So in that 4 extra months came at the perfect timing for the recall backers. COVID, schools were shut down, businesses were shut down. There was, increasing hospitalization rates. It was really just increasing infection rates. It was like a scary time. And at that same time, that's when Newsom went to that infamous dinner at the French Laundry, unmasked, lobbyist birthday, at the same time that he was telling Californians not to have multifamily gatherings for Thanksgiving. And so that image sort of just encapsulated what Newsom's critics do not like about him. And, they argue that he's elitist, that he's out of touch, that he's being hypocritical. And that happened right as these people are gathering signatures. So it was just like a perfect storm of getting that extra time and Newsom's own, some of the missteps he's made.
Yeah, that's right. And that, by the way, our extension came just at the French, almost exactly as the French Laundry happened. So that just fueled that. But you all have both talked to proponents of this recall. There is an anger, a grassroots anger, and maybe not just among some Republicans, about Newsom himself and his likability. Certainly we want to talk about some of the things he's accomplished as well, but let's just go to how they managed to get these 2.1 million signatures. No small deal in California. Who wants to take that? What is it about Newsom and his likability that allowed these signatures to get them to reach that goal?
And they had a really active, volunteer base, out collecting signatures. And these people were just really angry. It's part of it is that they don't like him, but part of it was really about the policies. You had moms that were angry that their kids were not in school, who were trying to juggle virtual learning while working at the same time. You had business owners who were really frustrated with constantly changing rules on, can they be open? Can they do takeout? Can they have people inside? Spending money to build, try to work with the guidance they're getting. And some of these rules were not set by the governor, quite frankly, but all the anger seems to have been directed at the governor. And so that's why I think it really just fueled these people. It's while we think of California as such a blue state, let's not forget Donald Trump got something like 6 million votes here. So there are a lot of Republicans in this state, and the signature requirements, they needed to get to roughly 1.5 million signatures. That is not a high bar.
Yeah. And Jenny, when it comes to the governor himself and his style of governing, the suggestion that he is elite, and the French Laundry incident. How much of that is fair? How much of that sort of washes over some of the accomplishments, the surplus, the economy, et cetera, in California? Just give us your thoughts on it.
I think whether it's fair or not, it's true. I've talked to lots of voters throughout the state, particularly in Southern California, and I can't think of anybody who has said, Gavin Newsom is my man. He is somebody that I am thrilled and excited about. He hasn't engendered, at least not among voters that I've spoken with, a lot of loyalty. It's not to say that some people like him, but it's not that they're not riled up and excited by him. They're not faithful to him. And he has, on the flip side of that, engendered a lot of anger. I think that image, just that notion, as Seema mentioned, it happened at a time in November. People are already sick of the pandemic. People were super frustrated, wanting to get together with families. And some people were anyway, and some people weren't. But then this image of him doing the very thing that he told you not to do just resonated, I think, so far and wide as a sign of hypocrisy. And I think regular voters are often looking for hypocrisy in their leaders. And that was, we're right. He's a hypocrite.
Yeah. As many times as we've watched him do a look at, say, the California budget and the finances and go deep. This is a guy who's talked about California being the next coming attraction. California is the 5th largest economy. He has boasted with grounds about the kind of surplus that California has. That hasn't seemed to help him this time around. No. Is that right?
Absolutely right. You see, and also, I think this, look at the messaging that's coming out of the anti-recall campaign. It is not about him. It is not about his accomplishments. It is that basically warning that if the recall is successful and any of these Republicans are elected the state's next governor, people are going to die. That is the final closing message that is coming out of the Newsom campaign. And that, I don't know, I'm sure they've done focus groups. There's a reason that they're not putting him and his accomplishments front and center.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about strategy right now, of how it's worked and whether it's worked. This campaign did not end up being a referendum on Gavin Newsom in many ways, it ended up being a referendum on COVID in some respects. Am I correct? Jenny, want to take that? Or?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that was Newsom's strategy, is to not make it a referendum on him, but to make it a referendum on COVID. And I remember this point in June where I was talking to both the recall supporters and Newsom's campaign, where people were saying, well, the pandemic's going to get so much, we're at the end, things are over, and he's going to be held to account for shutting things down. And of course, that's not what happened. We had this huge Delta surge, and we have people in hospitals at super high numbers. And not at all to suggest that that's what the Newsom campaign wanted, but that I think certainly has worked in their favor, frankly, because people are scared again, and people are thinking, well, maybe he was right to shut things down. Maybe that wasn't such a crazy thing to do. I think we've gotten to the point in this pandemic where things are more and more polarized, and so there's much less of a middle than there might have been perhaps even just a couple months ago.
And Seema, I mean, we've seen in the beginning, the Newsom campaign started out talking about Trump a lot. They still are. Has that been an effective strategy? That this is a Republican recall, that this is a Trump-backed recall? How effective has that been on that front? And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks that we should be watching for.
I mean, both in terms of labeling this, the Republican recall, excuse me, as well as tying it to Trump, and also tying it to COVID. And, it's sort of a campaign based on fear, and fear can be motivating. And like in terms of Democratic voters, we knew early on in the summer, the polling showed that they were not as enthusiastic. And but it looks like, with the PPIC poll that just came out, it looks like, that this messaging has worked and has gotten them a little bit more motivated. And if you look at the vote by mail ballots that have been turned in, more than 2-1 Democrat versus Republican, although, I think Republicans will vote more on election day for other reasons we can discuss later. But it seems like the combination of all of this, is working. I
mean, and both of you have done reporting on this in terms of who's turning out, whose ballots we're seeing and who's not. Young people, Latinos. Jenny, you've done a bunch of reporting on Latino voters. Can you talk about why Latinos don't seem to be fired up about Gavin Newsom and are not turning out here so far?
I think there's a couple things going on. I mean, first of all, Latino voters in the state are relatively young. There's not where Latino voters are in that younger category, who are turning in ballots at a much lower rate. So those two things go hand in hand. And it goes back to what I talked about before, which is just enthusiasm. I mean, I can't tell you how many young Latino voters I talked to who were so fired up about the presidential race and fired up about Bernie Sanders. And those very same people seem to just not care or not be aware or certainly not engaged with the fact that there is a recall happening now. And that's for a whole bunch of different reasons. But a big part of it is because the campaign and the party hasn't done had not up until very recently made an enormous effort to reach those voters. But again, part of it, I think, is ideological. Like, Newsom is not this populist who has gotten a bunch of young people fired up. And those people are some of the voters that he really needs in order to be able to win. In order to be able to win with the kind of margins, I think, that we at least initially expected.
Yes, I mean, Seema, you've written about this in terms of what are those ballots? What are we finding from those ballots? And you talked about how, Republicans are energized, but there's a difference this time around. They usually vote early, correct? Talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the ballots being returned.
Right. I mean, this, I think we're up past 5 million ballots returned, and there's out of a total of roughly 22 million. And one of the things that this election is taking place at a time when voting traditions and voting norms have sort of been upended because of former President Trump. Back in the day, until very recently, Republicans always voted early and Democrats turned out on election day. And because the president really sort of sowed this distrust of mail voting, questioned the integrity of mail voting, that's completely flipped on its head. So now Democrats are all voting early and Republicans are like, I'm not turning on my ballot till election day, till I can go and vote in person. So that's another reason why I think this race is really unpredictable. And then also, just to add to what Jenny said about Latino voters and young voters, I mean, we also have to say, traditionally, these are two groups of voters that turn out in presidential elections, and they are hard to get to turn out during during even midterm elections. And then here you have a weird election during an off year in September. So it just makes that task that much harder. But the Newsom campaign, I think they've said they're investing something like an 8-figure sum into turning out these voters in communities of color across the state.
I mean, and when you talk about younger voters and Latino voters, we see those ads for Elizabeth Warren. I know a lot of people said to me, well, why are they using Elizabeth Warren? What is that about? She's coming here next week. We saw the Bernie ad drop, I think it was last week. What's the strategy behind that? Jenny, you want to take that one? I mean, why are they going to those particular electeds to make the case for Newsom?
So the Bernie one goes back to what we're talking to. He had an enormous amount of loyalty and enthusiasm from young voters and from Latino voters. It feels like a million years ago now, but before, just as the pandemic was starting, Bernie won California, and that was at a time when it was looking possible like he might win the nomination. And so he has a lot of loyalty. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I talk to who say I'm a Bernie voter. Not I'm a Democrat, but I'm a Bernie supporter. So it's a no-brainer for him. In fact, I'm in a way surprised that Bernie hasn't come out here to do an event for him. But to Warren, I think Warren's ad was really telling in that they wanted loyal Democrats, people who see themselves as dyed-in-the-wool liberals, to vote early. They wanted those numbers to help them early on. It will be fascinating to see who is at this event on Saturday. Elizabeth Warren did not have an enormous support among Latinos in the state. She did not even necessarily have a lot of young people riled up for her in the state. So who shows up to that and sort of what they're trying to accomplish with that, I'm not sure. Part of it is just media attention too. I think us who are in this all the time, forget how little attention most people are paying to it until these very final few days.
Yeah, I know Seema, Kamala Harris, of course, was supposed to come out. Then the massacre in Kabul happened. Do you think she's still going to make it? Is Joe Biden going to make it or going to make an ad? How much of those?
I think after what happened in Afghanistan, the chances are not that great. The optics would be horrible. And then what's happening in that country is like an incredible tragedy. And I have a hard time seeing it.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see what happens in that event Saturday. As you said, Jenny, I think that's one to watch. I want to talk a little bit about some of the competition Newsom faces, and that we saw that in the PPIC poll last night. Larry Elder's gotten a big bump. He's now at 26%, I think. Let's talk a little bit about him and his effects on the race. Seema, how much did Larry Elder change the whole
shook up the entire race? I mean, he entered very late. He entered in mid-July, and so that's like 2 months before Election Day, and probably only 4 weeks before ballots started arriving in mailboxes. And he has a very loyal following because he's on the radio for decades, and he was on TV in LA at one point, and he's on Fox News all the time. So people, the conservative voters who are really riled up or really passionate about this recall, they know him. He is not an unfamiliar face to them, and he's been able to raise nobody's raised anywhere close to as much money as Newsom, obviously, but Elder has been able to raise a decent amount of money very quickly, and he has a lot of name ID. So he also has this, because he's on the radio for so long, he has this immense amount of records of what he's said, and he said there are things you can say as a shock jock that you perhaps would not say if you're running for office. So he has this very lengthy history that is being poured through by his rivals on both sides and the media. So, there's been a lot of stories that have come out about some of the very controversial things he said about, women in the workplace and just so many topics. So it's been a really interesting ride. And it's also, so you look at these other Republican candidates, the ones who've been running sort of the traditional campaigns, like Kevin Paffer, John Cox, going around the state, laying out some policy proposals. The average voter is not paying attention to that at all, because it's been, first there was the big Caitlyn Jenner burst, and that was in the spring, and then that sort of faded away. And then there's this big Elder burst. So I think one of the interesting things is that Kevin Paffer, for a long time, for years, people have talked about him as, if California's ever going to elect another statewide Republican, in modern times, he was the right model for it. And if he comes in at the numbers we're seeing now, was it single digits? Like, this is a huge blow to his potential future.
Yeah, I mean, Jenny, your thoughts? I mean, Elder kind of blew up the Republican side in the sense of he has Bigfooted all the other candidates. Is that a good thing? I mean, for the Republican Party, and just generally, how are you seeing his campaign?
I mean, I think the Republican Party here is in such an interesting position in the state. There has been no elected statewide Republican since Arnold Schwarzenegger. As Seema said, people thought that Faulconer was the model. He is doing terribly in the polls, has not gotten a lot of support. The state party is not did not endorse anybody officially. An elder came in and has gotten a base. And so it puts the party in this weird position of, do we go with moderates where we think there are lots of independents and moderates in the state, or do we go with the far right base? I mean, I will tell you, I was at an event last night with Mike Garcia, who's the congressman from the Simi Valley, at the Reagan Library. And this crowd was 100% an elder crowd. They were enthusiastic about him. That was who they were excited about. I did not come across anybody who was looking at any other Republican. So if you think about who is supporting the recall, that's the kind of candidate that they seem to be looking for.
But hasn't Larry Elder in so many ways been a gift to the Newsom campaign?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
He provided the absolute foil they needed to say, see, do you want this guy to be governor? Taking some of those statements, whether it's, I love Stephen Miller and hope he becomes president someday. I mean, there's been, that was in an LA Times profile. There's been a number of them. Seema, what do you think? I mean, has Larry Elder been the single biggest asset to Gavin Newsom?
I mean, early on, as you said, we talked about earlier, the Newsom campaign or the anti-recall campaign was defining this as Trump, January 6th, et cetera. That was in part, I think, because that's the message that appeals to Democrats, obviously, but also none of these other candidates were really that definable. Like, people don't know, even though John Cox was the 2018 Republican nominee, people don't really know who he is. If you ask the random Californian on the street, they don't think they would know who Kevin Paffer is, Kevin Kiley. So there wasn't a definable rival. But with Larry Elder, not only is he a definable rival because a lot of people in the state know him, but he has made just so many interesting statements over the last decades that that they just had like a plethora of I don't even know if they had interns locked in a basement listening to Larry Elder for 12 hours a day, and they probably still haven't gone through half of his stuff. I mean, there's just so much out there.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree. And that is personal stuff and his media strategy. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen a candidate basically block out an entire major newspaper, the Sacramento Bee, as Larry Elder has. But
I think Donald Trump in the Des Moines Register, where they wouldn't let register reporters in, and like the poor reporters would have to stand in the snow for 4 hours in line waiting to get in. So he is taking his cues from the former president, I think.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested. You all are on the ground. You've seen a lot of of the events. I have too. Any thoughts of like, what are your best hits or your biggest hits from covering the recall, the most memorable moments? I'll just give you mine, which was being there in Sacramento, about 5 feet from a 1,000-pound Kodiak bear with that unleashed in front of the press corps. At that point, I thought, maybe we're going to have some tragic headline where the bear comes charging the reporters. I don't know. But that to me was like, wow, we've never seen anything like that. But just in terms of out there talking to voters and out there watching the candidates, Seema, what, just let me start with you on that one. And
sure.
What have you seen?
I was reminded of the powers of incumbency when I saw Newsom at Universal Studios with like a transformer and
Minions.
And also in that game show setting where it was like the lottery. And,
you get $1 million and you get $1 million.
But also that goes back to that time period where they really thought in the fall things would be back to normal, everyone would be vaccinated, kids would be back in school, businesses would be open, life would be good, and they took a gamble with that also in terms of moving the election date up.
Yeah, Jenny, what about you?
I'm bad at memory. So the thing that comes to mind is recently I was in Orange County and seeing along the, like right off the freeway exits there, these little Trump, little stores. I mean, I don't know what you call them, little pop-ups with Trump campaign paraphernalia and anti-Newsom paraphernalia. And there's the slogans, my governor is an idiot, or I come from a shithole state. Excuse me. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on PPIC events. I just think it's remarkable. It's remarkable to be reminded we do have a deep division in the state. We think of California as being so deep blue, but as Seema referenced already, there are a lot of Trump supporters and voters here. And this is a way for them to assert their voice, to sort of get revenge or to try to take power and even just to band together. I mean, I think wearing those t-shirts is an act of like showing I don't agree with what's going on in the state, sort of their version of not my president. And I just seeing those divisions are a pretty powerful reminder for those of us who live in, say, central LA or central San Francisco, where we don't see that as much.
Yeah. I mean, and when you talk about the campaign on the ground. And when we talk about some of the other competition here, I just want to mention, I do think it's fascinating that Kevin Faulconer, who has been out there with policy, proposals in depth up and down the state, doing kind of a very traditional campaign, has ended up at 5%. How did that happen? Kylie is another one who has, a knowledge at Sacramento, an elected official, 3%. Just talk about what's going on there.
Kylie,
We're not in.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we're not in normal times anymore. As you said, he's doing traditional campaigning, and this is just not a time where anybody can win with a traditional campaign. Politics has all become nationalized. We're all, very much in our own little social media holes. I just don't think that is such a winning strategy. I'm not sure that we knew how much of a losing strategy it was, but it clearly is just not resonating at a time when we're mostly at home. We're very much sucked into our own holes, and people just aren't, again, it's an off year and it's not even November. People aren't engaged.
I think most Californians don't know who Kevin Paffer or Kevin Kiley are, and they have not raised. California is such an expensive state. It has some of the most expensive media markets in the nation, and they have not raised enough money to have enough ads up to really bump up their name ID. Secondly, Kevin Paffer, he is not the people who are supporting the recall. They are angry and they are not looking for moderation. And Kevin Paffer, he is fiscally conservative, but he is socially more moderate. In 2016, he spoke out against Trump, although he did embrace him in 2020. So the people who are supporting the recall, he is not their type of candidate. They view him probably as a Republican in name only, and I'm sure you guys see him get called that. And then Kevin Kiley, I think he's interesting. I think he's very smart, and I think he's going to be someone to watch in the future of the Republican Party. But he's very young, and I think even people in his district, half them probably don't know who he is. So the idea that he would get some sort of statewide name ID is it's really, without tens of millions of dollars, it's really kind of impossible.
Carla, other thing I wanted to add is that when you think about how much attention and money has been spent on this campaign, it's really remarkable how little has changed. Mark started by talking about the PPIC poll. It's been relatively, when you look at the top line, it really hasn't moved much. It hasn't moved much from when they started polling, and it really hasn't even moved much from when the election happened, from when Newsom got elected.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that's been one of the surprises here. I just, before we move on to sort of another issue on the actual candidates, can we just talk really fast about Caitlyn Jenner in the sense of 1% in the polls? As Seema Mehta, I think you'd be, Jenny, both of you would be 1% if you were running for governor right now. How do you lose 75% of your audience when she probably had more name recognition than anybody else, maybe including Gavin Newsom?
Right. She went to Australia for what, 3 weeks? I don't know how many weeks, but she left the campaign for, to go to the other side of the world to film a reality television show. And I think that may indicate to voters a lack of seriousness.
Yeah, I think so. When we talk about, some of the memorable moments too of the campaign, I got to say, I've covered Newsom a couple of times now on the side of the road, cleaning up homeless encampments. I have to say that I don't know how that's played on both sides. I know I talked to an East Bay Democratic elected official who told me that was one of the reasons she was going to vote yes on the recall. She said she has been trying to get the governor to clean up those homeless encampments for 2 years in Emeryville and Berkeley, that area, and to no effect. And then he comes in and does a photo op. This issue of homelessness, can you both address this? It just seems to me that this has come to a tipping point in California where people are just saying, even progressives are saying, enough already. I just don't want to see them anymore. I don't care what happens. I don't want to see them. Seema, LA is, Jenny, LA. That's the.
You're thinking Venice, and you see. I'm in Long Beach right now, and you see it in very liberal places. People are just fed up. I've lived in California now for 23 years. I've never seen anything like this. It's back before there was Skid Row, which was always horrible and tragic, but it was sort of more contained. And now it's everywhere. And I do think, this is an issue that cuts across the political spectrum. And it's also, I don't want to say it's impossible to solve, but it is an enormous issue. And there are no easy solutions here. The Republican candidates who are running are obviously, this is something that they're pointing out that I think resonates with a lot of voters, regardless of your party. But the question is, who do you trust to solve it or even to make a dent in it?
Absolutely. I mean, Carla, I go back to your question about elder being the gift to the Newsom campaign. I mean, Faulkner's advisors, I remember telling me very early on that that was one of the issues they really wanted to focus on. And they thought they were going to get moderates and Democrats by saying, look at the homelessness in your backyard. What has changed since Newsom got into office? Isn't it worse? And they thought that was really an effective argument. But that we haven't seen that. We haven't seen that as being the biggest issue in the last final weeks of the campaign. Instead, we have the pandemic, and you're going to have a Trump supporter as governor. Those have been the two most resonant issues. So it's fascinating. I agree that it is worse than ever. I talked to more people who are fed up than ever, yet it really has not, at least so far, and we're only, 12 days out, has not been the thing that the campaign has centered on.
There's a couple other issues that some of the proponents have focused on. The uptick in crime here in California. You got those viral videos of people going into Walgreens and ripping it off, et cetera. And that is one thing, people get worried about getting their cars broken into. You kind of wonder, this is not something Gavin Newsom has to worry about on any given day. Are people feeling that he is ignoring that issue, the crime issue, more parolees out on the streets, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, recall supporters, that's 100% part of the message. And for people who support the recall, that does resonate. I think the thing is, for Democrats and for people who, and maybe also for MPPs, the issue of COVID is just overtaking both of these issues, homelessness and crime, to the idea that, people look at places that have anti-mask mandates, or places that have been really sort of loose with rules in terms of mingling and dining and schools and everything. They look at Florida, Texas, Arizona, and the polling shows Democrats don't want that here. So I think COVID has just overtaken everything.
Yeah, no, and what about the EDD scandal?
And that's another thing that would get in normal times would get huge attention. But it's getting some attention, but it just is not getting the as much attention as COVID.
Yeah, as we know, the strategy on the Newsom team was to move up the election to September, hoping to avoid whatever else is coming down the pike in November, a wildfire season, et cetera. How's it looking now, Jenny, in terms of that? What have been the challenges in moving up this election? And what is it? Does it look like it was a good idea?
My answer right now is very different than my answer might have been 2 weeks ago. So I really hate to say what my answer will be 2 weeks from now, which is when it really matters. I think there was a moment where it looked like an idiotic idea because people weren't paying enough attention, and supporters of Newsom were not at all engaged. And the most interested people were the folks who were in favor of the recall. Now that has flipped. Democrats and independents are starting to tune in. Democrats particularly are very freaked out and are voting and are sending in their ballots. So right now it looks like a really wise decision. What it looks like come September 14th, I think is really hard to say. I think we really don't know yet. Do Republicans show up in force, and what happens to independents? No party affiliation, no party preference is one of the biggest groups in the state, and how those people vote really matters. And I don't think we honestly have enough to know. We cannot predict what will happen. I think elections in this country have shown us don't predict anything.
That is so true. And Seema, I know that another sort of aspect of this recall that has changed over time is the strategy by the Newsom team not to offer another Democrat on that ballot. Just talk a little bit about that. For a while, that Democrats were
for the Newsom team and for his allies, it was viewed as a great success that they were able to keep another prominent Democrat off the ballot. Then I think in recent weeks, when some of the polling was suggesting that it's much closer than people expected it to be, there were some real second thoughts about that. There's also just been a lot of confusion about the ballot. I've heard this from so many voters. If I vote no on the recall, but then I write somebody in, or vote for somebody on the replacement list, does that cancel my no vote? There's a lot of confusion. Can I write in Newsom? No, you can't write in Newsom. It won't count for anything. So there's just been a ton of confusion. Then I think there are some people who would argue that while the decision not to have a Democrat on the replacement list is potentially strategically wise for Newsom, that it is perhaps not civically wise, because say if you're even if you oppose the recall, if the recall is successful, somebody on that second list is going to be governor, and if you care about sort of how the state is run, it's that that, they should have, they should pick somebody who is most, there's a difference between the candidates, the 46, now 45 people who are running, and people should pick somebody who is most closely aligned with what their beliefs are.
Jenny, do you think we're going to see sort of a reprise of the same kind of doubts about the integrity of this election, maybe coming from some conservatives after it's over? Say Newsom does win, which the polls suggest he might. We've already seen online people like Richard Grinnell and others raising questions about the integrity of the mail ballot, suggesting the holes in the envelope, which are there so visually impaired people can tell where to sign, by the way, that these are somehow an effort to find out what you're voting and possibly to throw away the vote. I know in Torrance, there was a lot of concern. I got a lot of emails about a theft that involved guns, some drugs, and about 300 ballots. And the cops there were saying they were investigating and not exactly sure, was this a real attempt at stealing ballots or maybe just a mail theft thing. But the bottom line is, do you think questions will be raised no matter how, whether the election is stolen, depending, as we've seen nationally?
I think that election integrity, as some people will put it, has become such a partisan issue. There's almost no doubt it will be brought up in the wake of this election. I think the question for the Newsom folks is really how big. I think now they have sort of pivoted to thinking about the margin. It's not only a question of if he wins, but by how much. And so if the margin is really large, then perhaps it becomes a less resonant issue. But, we in California have a notoriously long time for counting these ballots. And we saw last cycle Republicans sow doubt in that time frame. We were waiting for the time from election day to the time we actually had an election called. That was when we saw a lot of doubts. I think that it is almost a certainty we will have that here.
We're gonna take questions from the audience in about 5 minutes. I just want to remind you all, PPIC event questions at gmail.com. Send them in to us, and Mark is going to be coming back for some of those questions so we can talk about that. Let us talk about, is this a lock right now? Is there a way that the Republicans could pull this out, that the proponents of this could pull this out, given what the polls are? And there is some suspicions publicly when you look at people out there about polls in general. And I guess the question is, how much will the margin matter to the future of Gavin Newsom? Seema, you want to start out?
I know nothing is a lock right now. Because this is an unpredictable election. It's an election unlike any we've seen before. So, I think pollsters and other people are trying to do their best to model who they think will turn out, but we don't know. And we shouldn't, it's like, that's why I don't think we should make any predictions. And the margin absolutely matters. If he wins, he wins. But if he wins by, 20 points, that sort of represents a real repudiation of this effort and a mandate for his agenda. If he wins by 1 point, this guy in a super blue state, that's not a great look. He's still governor and he still has Democrats super majorities in both houses, but it's, for somebody who wants to be president, as he does, it's not a great look to not be able to hang on to a state as blue as California, or to only hang on by a point or two.
Yeah. Jenny, your thoughts?
I think, Seema just alluded to it, for a guy who wants to be president. We can't forget how big Newsom's ambitions have been in the past. And so they are not going to be satisfied with a 51-49 result. They are going to work to get a much bigger margin than that and really have some sort of mandate and enter him back, frankly, on the national scene. I think Governor Newsom was really somebody looked at as like the future of the Democratic Party, and he has sort of faded from that. Kamala Harris obviously is in the vice presidency, and she is from here. And, this is his chance to get back into that mix, as to the talk of into the presidential aspiration list. I think it also, as Seema alluded to, has big policy implications. Sort of what things he feels free to do will depend on how much he wins by. And if he wins. Also, just if you think back to where we were like 15 months ago, you had people, the White House not really, not showing a ton of leadership, with COVID, and you had, Governor Cuomo in New York, Governor Newsom in California, viewed as like the two guys who are doing this right, who are really, stepping up, addressing this. And look at how, we all know what happened with Governor Cuomo, and the fact that Newsom's even, in battling this. It's amazing how politics works and how things change.
Yeah. In fact, we've talked about that, how the stakes for the Democratic Party nationally potentially huge if they lost Andrew Cuomo, of course, with another Democratic governor there, but if they lose Gavin Newsom here on the West Coast, that is a very big blow in terms of 2022.
Just the messaging. I mean, it's like, people in other states, like, got the every governor of Texas recently, governors, the governor of Florida, they like to say like, oh, look at California's going to hell. And if a Republican is elected to the governor of California, that just, there'll be so much crow. I mean, there'll be so much, there'll be a lot of snark. And I think that would really motivate Republicans nationwide as we go into the midterm elections.
Yeah, no question about it. And we've got some questions from the audience here. I'm going to start with that, and I think Mark's going to be coming back for some of them too. Karina Macias from the council member from Huntington Park says, my question focuses on the ripple effects of a change in governor. If Governor Newsom is recalled, what are the possible implications in the California state legislature and on national levels moving forward? I don't know, Mark, you want to take that or?
I think it's for the three of you. And let me just say that I've just learned so much from listening to the three of you. It's such a broad and deep conversation that's taken place. But now I think that this one goes to you.
Seema or Jenny?
I think if the recall is successful and a Republican is elected governor, I think the legislature will move very quickly to reduce any powers that they can. And we've seen this in other states where Republican-held legislatures have done that when a Democrat was elected governor. But still, if the governor has executive authority, has appointments, so the governor will be able to do a lot. But it'll be interesting to see. I mean, it depends on what the next governor, if there's a next governor, decides to focus on. Is there a chance for bipartisan agreements on some of these things? I mean, we just don't know. And then in terms of national elections, I mean, the infrastructure that the pro recall forces and the Republicans are putting in now, I mean, there's definitely a concentration in these contested congressional districts, and they will use that infrastructure going into 2022.
Yeah, because that's where Republicans, of course, are putting a lot of concentration here in California, those House races, the 2020 House races. Go ahead, Jenny, go ahead.
Well, just to key both of those things. I mean, California has the keys to the House, to control of the House. We have a lot of competitive districts here. And as Seema's saying, those are going to be, they have infrastructure. I just mentioned, I was in the 39th district over the weekend and saw recall signs and Trump signs everywhere. And the other big thing is that the governor could very well appoint another senator. If Senator Feinstein retires or God forbid something happens to her, there could be another appointment, and that's control of the Senate right there. If a Republican appoints a Republican to the Senate, the Democrats lose control of that House as well.
Yeah, no, huge implications.
Well, the question is, if the recall is successful, there's a window of about 38 days, I think, before the next governor is elected takes office. And so if that were to happen, I mean, would Senator Feinstein consider, she's always really dug in when people suggest that, maybe it's time for her to retire. But if that happens, in that 38-day window, I mean, would she consider stepping down?
Yeah, actually, and we've heard a couple of sort of buzzy scenarios out there. Well, what happens if there really is, if Newsom is recalled? Could the supermajority in both houses impeach Larry Elder? There's a number of scenarios out there that people are looking at, but I think that's fascinating. We got a question here from Bob Mulholland, which many of us know is a Democratic strategist who's been around many years. His question is, while a majority of Republicans support the recall, did a lack of a Republican Party endorsed candidate leave their voters in the desert and losing enthusiasm? Any thoughts on that?
I don't think so. I think their argument was allegedly that they wanted to keep party unity by not irritating the supporters of the other candidates. There's a lot of people who question that, who believe that that there was some people who were trying to sort of fix it for Kevin Paffer. But it's, I mean, how much of this is about the party versus how much of this is about these, the recall supporters who, and, there's overlap, but it's not a perfect, Venn diagram. And so I don't know that costs any enthusiasm.
Yeah, I think that, as you said, a lot of the momentum in the beginning was to endorse Kevin Faulconer. Then Larry Elder got in the race. I think it was just another example of how Elder sort of bigfooted the race in many ways, became the focus of attention, and the other candidates got no oxygen. And I think the Newsom people just loved that aspect of it. And that's where we're ended up. Mark, we got a question on the poll here. Why wasn't Kevin Paffer out, and that's the Democrat, young 29-year-old YouTube phenomenon, included in the poll? Other polls had him at number 2 in the race.
Mhm. Yeah, there was another poll at one time that had him number 2 in the race. So we made a determination before we went into the field, like we always do when there's a long list of candidates, because we do live telephone interviewing, about what the criteria would be for the candidates we name, and then allowing the possibility of the respondent naming other candidates. So, and in the case that we're talking about here, this election, there were 2 issues that surfaced for us that were the defining criteria. One was fundraising and the fundraising figures at the time. Of course, there'll be new fundraising figures apparently coming out today on September 2nd. So we'll all take a look at those with great interest. But at the time, it was fundraising and major media citations. And there were 5 candidates and only 5 who reached that threshold that created those mentions. Now, in our poll, there were 4% who named other names that are on the ballot among the other 41, and there were 14 mentions of the person who came in second in other polls, which would have been 1% mentions. Actually, there were mentions of people like Bernie Sanders and Jackie Spire, and Gray Davis was mentioned once. Gavin Newsom mentioned several times, any Democrat, any Republican, but there were a number of people, 4%, who named the other candidates altogether. But, you know, again, I was more struck by the fact that half the people either said no one or I don't know, and 2/3 of those who were voting no said that. So Larry Elder, clearly the choice among the people who were voting yes.
And Mark, can you explain one other thing about the polls? I know that your poll, the PPIC poll, has been pretty consistent in terms of this double-digit lead all the way along. Some of the other polls have not been, and in fact, kind of lit a fire on, I think, under some of the Democrats who looked at those early things, suggesting it was a dead heat, and freaked out the Democratic base, which is, I know, you know, the Newsom team probably just love that aspect of it. Yeah. Explain how, you know, your breakdown of what constitutes a likely voter and so forth may differ from other pollsters, or why is there such a variance in some of these polls?
Yeah, so, you know, I can't speak for other polls because I don't know enough about how each one determines likely voters, but in terms of ours, we thought very deliberately about the timing, and we wanted to have the survey in the field after people got the ballots in their mailbox, because we felt like that was making things real in a way that we were more abstract in our March and May survey. We don't try to, we never try, and it's just been, you know, I follow the lead of other national pollsters, but we don't try to predict the turnout. What we do is we have a series of questions which we ask about your past voting, your interest in politics, whether you're registered to vote, and closer to the election, we add 2 questions to our likely voter screen, which is how closely you're following news about the election and whether you plan to vote or have actually voted. And so it's predetermined by how people answer those questions. I don't try to guess about, oh, it's going to be 40% or it's going to be 50%. So if you look at differences between polls, to me, always the most important, the thing that I go to in our poll first is among likely voters is, what is the margin between Democrats and Republicans? Okay. And in our poll, our last poll, it was 18 points. Normally it's around 22. I mean, normally it's like the registration is 22 points, right? So that means that Republicans are voting in larger numbers, but not in great larger numbers. And of course, given what the 46 to 24 margin between Democrats and Republicans in registration, there'd have to be a big difference. So if you went and looked at the other polls, in addition to the timing, I would look at, what was the margin among voters, especially in an election like this, because Democrats and Republicans are highly polarized. If they remain this highly polarized, then, which they have throughout our poll consistently, then what you would need to do to win a recall election like this, similar to what Schwarzenegger did, but you'd have to do it in even greater proportions. You'd have to do really, really well among independent voters in California. So that's the other number I'd look for, is like, what's going on with independent voters, those no party preference voters, because Republicans don't have enough registered voters in the state, unless there was something that was completely, out of balance in terms of voter registration.
And I think, Seema, you wrote about this, the independents are not turning in, right? They're sort of underperforming so far.
That's the thing I think we have to look at, and that could show us some trends as we see these vote by mail ballots come in. Who are they coming in from? Where's the enthusiasm? And at some point, this does just becomes a turnout question. I mean, well, it's always a turnout question, but if they reach certain numbers in terms of turnout, just because of the sheer number of Democrats in the state versus the sheer number of Republicans in the state, the higher the turnout gets, the more difficult it becomes for the recall backers to be successful.
Yeah. Okay. We got a good question here. In light of developments in Texas and with the Supreme Court, what would you say are the risks for women's rights if Governor Newsom is recalled and Larry Elder, who's against abortion rights, gets elected in terms of a policy change in California? Jenny, you want to handle that one?
A really great question. I have to say, before I answer, I was struck last night being with a large group of like 200 Republicans and being very aware of what was going on in Texas. It was striking to me that abortion did not come up there among this group of California Republicans. I think Seema talked about this before. I think it's really a question of how the government interacts. If there's a new governor, how that Republican governor would interact with the legislature. I mean, you can't underestimate the power of the legislature here, where Democrats have a supermajority. A governor isn't a king who can just sort of strike down mandates. On the other hand, could there be sort of really creative ways in which he could restrict abortions? I think absolutely possible.
Yeah, I think judges and also who he appoints is another area, although he said yesterday he doesn't think that's going to be, Larry Elder did, at the top of his list should he become governor. Mark, we got a good question from Francine Kiefer at the Christian Science Monitor. The poll makes Newsom look pretty comfortable in this election. Do you think it could turn out to be closer than your poll indicates? And if so, why?
It could certainly turn out to be closer. And that's because any poll is a snapshot in time. Our poll was conducted from the 20th to 29th of August. We chose not to do the polling later because I didn't want to poll over the Labor Day weekend, which, so it was all around the September 14th schedule. And there's always a possibility that things can happen during these 2 weeks that will change minds, although we've seen how polarized the electorate is. But I think more importantly, and all of you will be on this, in this event today, will be following what ballots are submitted, and whether that's different from that 18-point gap that we saw in our likely voters in our poll.
Exactly. I one of the things I think we want to get to and asking about, we've seen California, as was mentioned, only 4 recalls in the country and 2 of them in California. Is the process going to be reformed here? What's the likelihood of that? Seema, you want to start out there?
I think it's very, very likely. I mean, you're already hearing so many Democrats talk about this. There's a number of different ways. I think one of the proposals is to change it so that you can only have a recall for if there's issues of criminal conduct or malfeasance. Some other people are talking about increasing the bar in terms of the number of signatures required. We were both on a panel yesterday. Somebody talked about having the recall as one election and then having another election 30 days later to pick whoever the replacement candidate is. So in that way, the replacement would actually have a majority of votes. It wouldn't be the case where you can, get elected with like 20% of the vote or 25% of the vote. So I think that is undoubtedly going to come up.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, we're almost out of time. Jenny, has California become sort of a laughing stock with this processing that we've got?
I think people who want to make California a laughingstock will make it a laughingstock no matter what. And California boosters will make it a booster no matter what. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think people love to hate on California. We're the biggest state in the country and we're sort of a place apart. So we're an easy target in that regard.
Yeah, and I think, on the other side, proponents of democracy, proponents of the recall would say, hey, their voices have been heard with those 2.1 million signatures. And some of the questions are about, Gavin Newsom is somewhat responsible for those 2.1 million signatures. And we're out of time, Mark. Just quickly from you, based on your poll, is this a lock for the Democrats? I'll let you take it out from here.
Special election is never a lock for anyone. And as much as people are talking about, how much they have to worry about, I assure you they're worried, as people should be, because it's in the voters' hands. And whether they'll send back their ballots or not, we'll stay tuned. We'll find out. Many thanks to Carla, Jenny, and Seema for participating in today's program. It was truly an amazing program. We couldn't have done it without you. We have a huge audience here today, and they learned a lot from listening to the three of you, and they learned a lot from hearing you and listening to you during elections. And really appreciate your work beyond here today that you do for the state of California and the people of California. So thank you. I'd like to thank our sponsors. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, for your interest in this program. If you're pre-registered for today's event, later you will receive a survey. And we hope that you'll take a couple of minutes to let us know how we did and how we can improve our programs in the future. Thank you. Please be safe and have a good afternoon.